Continuing with our notes, this would be part 3 of the Timeline Cold War notes. We begin with John F. Kennedy's presidency with his cabinet members, VP Lyndon Johnson, Dean Rusk, Robert McNamara. Kennedy, along with his cabinet, were all very pro-war, also known as war hawks. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara has been attributed to the idea of the flexible response, which we went over in our starters. In order to briefly summarize the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have to go back a little bit to the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs, we were helping finance pro-American forces to take back over Cuba from Fidel Castro. So helping them in Mexico, giving them the supplies that they need, come over. They were supposed to attack the Bay of Pigs. We were supposed to help them out. That didn't happen, and a complete debacle. Castro knew what was going on. He was able to repel the attack, and he became very upset with the United States. Now, because he was upset with the United States, he went ahead and allowed the Soviets to start building weapons platforms inside of Cuba, thus the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you guys already know a lot about that because you watched 13 Days. Continuing with our timeline, in July 1963, we discuss a nuclear test ban treaty. It does become ratified between ourselves and the Soviet Union. This only goes so far. We just don't want to have any more radioactive elements in our atmosphere. We do realize that it causes cancer and some other not good things as far as chromosomes are concerned. Now, towards the end of Kennedy's presidency, of course, he dies. He gets assassinated. There's this idea of MAD, which stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. What this means is that if the Soviets fire a nuclear weapon at us, we will fire so many nuclear weapons at them, they'll do the same, and the entire planet will now be destroyed. So this idea of mutually assured destruction is supposed to be a deterrent to nuclear war. I don't want to go too in depth into the Kennedy assassination, but we need to talk about it just a little bit. So for the generation who lived during this time when Kennedy was assassinated, it's one of those moments in U.S. history where people, it's really burned into their minds. For myself, there's been a couple instances. One would be the September 11th attacks. I completely remember what I was doing that day, what happened. It was a complete shock to the nation. For you guys, it would be the shooting at both North Park Elementary and then also further south in San Bernardino. That's something that's kind of burned into your brain. So for this generation, when Kennedy gets assassinated, it's something that generationally it's a huge moment that people from that time frame, is burned into their minds. So let's go ahead and talk about Johnson. When Johnson takes over from Kennedy, he keeps pretty much the same cabinet members with the addition of Hubert Humphrey. So you still have the people who are in power, this idea of, Cold War mentality, domino theory, MAD, mutually assured destruction. This is something that's commonplace with the leaders at the time. We discussed LBJ's idea of the Great Society briefly in our starters. Ideally, LBJ really wanted to focus on domestic issues. This idea that poverty-stricken people inside the United States need a helping hand. For the most part, initially, at the beginning of his presidency, he downplayed Vietnam. But this is something you can't do when the Cold War is going on. So he was pulled into it. Great Society was somewhat on the back burner. He did make some efforts to help out the needy here in our country. But, Vietnam became the forefront, particularly when we have the Gulf of Tonkin incident. What the Gulf of Tonkin incident is all about is we have our naval vessels there in the Gulf of Tonkin, just outside of Vietnam, just east of Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin. And one of our naval frigates comes into contact with a very small Vietnamese boat. I refer to it as a boat and not a ship. There are some shots fired. It becomes a huge incident. And this is our reasoning into going more into Vietnam. A good comparison to this is the Spanish-American War. The idea of remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, wasn't necessarily Spain's fault, yet at the same time it was a reason to gear up for war. So we went ahead and dispatched 150,000 U.S. troops to Vietnam under the Vietnam Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And this is what really initiates the Vietnam police action. I know I use war sometimes, but in reality, we did not declare war in Vietnam. This was considered a police action. 3 years later, we're still at war in Vietnam. Like I've discussed before in our starters, it seemed as though we were doing well in the Vietnam War. On the nightly news, there was always a tally of body count. And per that body count, we were killing more Vietnamese, less Americans were dying, and this is how we considered ourselves winning during this time. So the American people were kind of duped. They felt that we were doing well until the Tet Offensive happened. The Tet Offensive, this is the Vietnamese New Year's holiday. However, if you're a true communist, you don't celebrate holidays. They didn't take the day off. We figured they would. We were having a good time. We figured the Vietnam people would not attack us during their holiday. They did, and they did very massively. During this offensive, it really showed the American people that we were not doing well. We weren't winning this war, and it was probably time to start backing off. There were many very famous newscasters who came out and stated this and really changed public opinion at this point. This is beginning to have some issues as far as American politics are concerned. We see both parties or entities in both parties not agreeing with what's going on in the Vietnam War, and we see some fractions within the parties themselves. Now, coupled with this, there's the My massacre, where many innocent Vietnamese died because of U.S. troops, their frustration. Once again, just to talk about starters again, we've talked about this. When you don't know who your enemy is, there's a sense of frustration because you don't know who's going to come out and shoot you. It could be a child, it could be a woman, it could be a pregnant woman. Someone who's in plain clothes is going to end up killing you. So the My massacre is kind of the epitome of the frustration that American troops saw at this time. And My is a village in Vietnam that was completely laid waste to by American troops. Women, children, men, whoever were in that village, they were killed. And this was publicized to the American people. And you can imagine how Americans felt at this time, seeing that their troops would do something like this. On our timeline, our group projects, somebody did the Dominican Republic, and then all the other South American countries that we did through that group project as well. We go ahead and send troops through to a variety of South American nations, Central American nations, to fend off communism. And in reality, we're protecting American interests, and at the same time, anything that has communist type influence, we are trying to get rid of it. We also have the 6-Day War, leads to near war with the U.S. and USSR. The 6-Day War has to do with the world as a whole and Israel. And we are supporting Israel, and the USSR is specifically, has a lot of support in Syria and then also Egypt as well. And this almost leads us to war. We have an incident in North Korea where one of our so-called research vessels, the spy ship attached to our naval fleet, is captured by North Korea. We state that it's in international waters. They say it's within their national waters, and they take it over. One American gets killed. The rest are captured. They're held for about a year, a little under a year. And even to this day, it is still held by North Korea, and it has become a museum to show, how great North Korea is. In August, there's an interesting situation where one of the Warsaw Pact countries of Czechoslovakia attempts to revolt from being within the sphere of the Soviets. They want a more democratic government. The Russians invade. Actually, not just the Russians, but the Warsaw Pact countries invade and make sure that it stays a good communist country. Increase of this idea of the Sino-Soviet split, meaning a split between Soviet communism and Chinese communism. With Khrushchev and some of the other leaders that we have in the Soviet Union, they're looking more towards a peaceful coexistence with the West, maybe opening up some trade, being more friendly, as were the Chinese. They are definitely against capitalist societies, and they don't want to see this. This is also referred to as de-Stalinization. Because remember, Stalin, pretty crazy guy. So because of this, Khrushchev was starting to back away from some of those Stalinist ideas and being more friendly with the West. But this is kind of against Marxism, which is completely against capitalism. And the idea of capitalism should be crushed. Now we have Brezhnev, who is the new communist leader in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev was relieved from power for multiple reasons, one being which the more liberalized society that he was trying to create within the Soviet Union, his mishandling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, his brash personality. A lot of people considered him an embarrassment to the Communist Party. So we have Brezhnev. Brezhnev was interested in a detente, which is a cooling off, if you will. He mentioned this to Johnson. Johnson's focus was elsewhere. He was looking more for a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and this was negotiated. So what a non-proliferation treaty is all about is not allowing other countries to become nuclear powers. More weapons out there, more entities out there, the more likely a nuclear catastrophe will occur. Johnson, by this point, was tired of being president. He didn't really see a lot of progression as far as his Great Society was concerned. Tired of the Vietnam War. He really didn't see an end to the Vietnam War happening. He couldn't foresee this. So he didn't run for a second term. Technically speaking, it would be kind of considered his third term. Remember, he took over for Kennedy. He was elected president for a full term. However, he could have run for another term, but he didn't want to. He just didn't see the need. He didn't have the drive. And so now we have a Republican becoming president. And this, of course, would be Nixon. If you remember, Nixon was also the vice president to Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower. So his face is there. The people know who he is. He's well respected at this point. And he runs on the platform that the Vietnam War will end during his term. The image that Nixon has during his tenure as president is Henry Kissinger. Kissinger is a Jewish refugee during the time of Nazi Germany. He is a political scientist. He understands geopolitical affairs very well. And throughout his time in government, very, very helpful to the country. Nixon, along with Kissinger, willing to accept reduced U.S. power in return for stability among superpowers and slowing of the arms race. This is what Kissinger was known for. He kind of understood who he was speaking to as far as geopolitics are concerned. So with both the Soviets and also the Chinese, we see some progression here as far as the Cold War is concerned. Nixon goes ahead and visits China. We're talking Cold War, so this is huge. Willing to actually make the effort to slow down this arms race, this proliferation of nuclear weapons, to limit the number of missiles that we're creating, to sell wheat. We have a huge surplus of wheat. And prior to the Cold War, we would sell a lot of our agriculture to Russia, Europe, whoever would